Thanks a lot for the great introduction. I'm very happy to be here, have this opportunity to give a talk, and also seeing both men and women here, because I think we need to address this governance issue together to ultimately make improvements. I think after the election in the US, I think it's pretty clear for everybody that it can get worse if we're not doing anything about it. Something that we're seeing is that we have an increased hostility against excellent women. And this is not only coming from our male colleagues, but also from women. So I think nobody's excluded here. So please stay tuned. First of all, in the beginning, equal treatment may feel like reverse discrimination, but it's not. So as we are having in a male-dominated environment, like the science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine, where all the leadership is white male, and as more women in Switzerland, it's mostly a question about minority women, as more women are coming in, things are changing. We see actually that more and more of the male colleagues feel like that there is reverse discrimination. I think many of you have heard that a young white male was saying, I don't have a chance to become a professor anyhow because I don't have the right sex. I don't know how many of you have heard that. I know that's being said many, many times. Or people say to a young woman, oh, you know, you have it easy because you're a woman, you're going to get a professor position. It doesn't even matter how well you perform. Both of these things are wrong, and I hope I can convince you about this. But this is becoming more and more of a problem. So we have more women entering the field. So M is really not a typo. It is because math and medicine has a very similar problem in this regard. With more women coming in, you don't neglect half of the population anymore. So there's more competition for pretty much the same number of positions. If you can just exclude half of the population by saying, yeah, the women are not intelligent enough and they can't do it, then of course more guys get in. Simple math, right? Okay, so there is more competition for the limited number of professor positions. And of course, people feel this. We experience this escalation of hostility against women because there is also a pretty strong political pressure to get more women in. If we don't do anything, I will show you on examples, people are more likely to hire the same looking people into the position, feel more comfortable, may even think, oh my God, if we get a woman in, things become complicated, or I even have to watch out what I'm saying, you know? Things are really changing when we have a larger diversity. I think personally that this is for the better. And I actually think I would like to convince my male colleagues that they're also convinced that this is for the better for them, in the heart and in the head, both ways, because if we're not doing both, we're not making the change. With this reverse discrimination, partially also because there is a lack of understanding on the issues. As a woman in this field, sooner or later, you're gonna be confronted with some kind of discrimination. You're treated differently. And you have to cope with it. And I coped with this by starting to read, trying to understand what is actually different and how do I deal with it. So I went through quite an impressive number of books and papers and reading, which my male colleagues didn't do. At one point, I actually tried to give to the department head in physics a book to read. This guy told me I don't need to be brainwashed. I mean, if we stop getting educated about issues, that's when we don't make progress. So we need to have a clear plan for DEI. I mean, already people go, what's DEI anyway? And a lot of people understand something different. But it basically goes back that we should have equal rights and equal opportunities. And it should be based on performance. And we need everybody engaged with this plan. And the current situation really needs additional measures. This is, for example, from a paper that we published here with some colleagues just recently, where we bring concrete examples. What is basically holding women back. You know, I don't want to read now everything. I make the copy of this talk available to everybody. When you look at purely at the numbers, you know, we have now about equal amount of men and women coming in at the lower level of the education. We have about equal numbers of women making the Matura in Switzerland. And as we, for example, move up in positions in academia, we have less and less women getting into this position. So from a pure mathematical point of view, it means that is for a man with a PhD, he has a higher chance to become a professor than a woman. That's what this graph is showing. So we're far away from any reverse discrimination, that the men are disadvantaged. So just with this graph alone. So if you're new to the field and want to get a little bit educated, why should we have more women actually in these fields? Because some may argue, why should we force the women to go into this technology if they don't like it anyway? Or they can't do it, or they don't fit in, and so on. But there is actually lots of reasons why we want to have the women in science and technology. And as a good starting point for the newcomers is read this book. This is written by a colleague of mine, a professor in physics, more recently published this book and explains all the arguments why we should have more women. I mean, if you think about it, how much technology and science is influencing our future, we for sure want to have more women being part of this and influencing our future. So it's a very simple argument. So this, we need to have everybody engaged, that we all believe it, that this is the right thing to do. And to just tell you how important this problem is still today is that at the National Academy of Science annual meeting in 2024, so to become a member of the US National Academy of Science is a big deal. That's kind of like, you know, the crown of your scientific career. And at that meeting this year, all the people received a free copy of the book, The Exceptions. And the book, The Exceptions, tells the story of Professor Nancy Hopkins and her women colleagues at MIT, where they got organized to fight for the women in science. This was a very important event because this all happened actually 1999. 1999, that was also the beginning of internet. MIT president announced to the world that MIT is discriminating against female professor. It came as a report, got into the New York Times. This was, of course, a very powerful message because MIT was at that time #1 and is today a #1. Admitting that they're discriminating against women didn't kill their excellence because they also did something about it. They also published a report, and the report became available on the internet. And I have to say, for me personally, it saved my life because 1999 was, at the beginning of 1999, I just had 2 kids at ETH, and I was about ready to quit because I couldn't stand it anymore. And by reading this report, I realized, oh my gosh, these women have the same problem as me. It's not me. It's actually a systemic problem, and it actually allowed me to push this problem away, not take it personally. And then I decided, oh, well, I'll stick it out and show them that I can do it, even in Switzerland. And so that MIT report was absolutely important. It went, I know a lot of women in my generation where this was a key event in their lives. And the book that was distributed then at the National Academy of Science in this year is basically telling the story of how this MIT report got together and gives also a deeper history. Actually, the beginning of the book is, to a certain extent, a little bit boring. You have to survive that a little bit to get then to the story where the women really got together and started fighting. But it also tells you a little bit the story, how it evolved, how women got some more rights and how they got into the science. It's really a good book to read. I mean, these two books I really would recommend to everybody to read. The MIT report came from an initiative of senior women professors at MIT who started to get together, collected data, and then approached the leadership at MIT. And this was actually the motivation ultimately for me when I stepped up into leadership. So 1999, I just had two small little kids, you know, survival mode of operation. And then 2010, I stepped up into a leadership and became a director of an NZCR. And as you know, when you're a director of an NZCR, you have to do something for the advancement of women. But you're pretty free and you have resources. And so I then used these women as my role model and started to organize the women at ETH and creating the Women Professor Forum. All these links, you can then look up a little bit the history, how we did it, and so on, just to show you what happened at MIT as the women got more organized. This shows you the number of women faculty, you know, from 1962 to 2010. I mean, I was the first higher tenure professor in physics at ETH in 93. I was one of the first 10 professors who were hired at ETH. So we're at least 20 years behind what was happening at MIT. So the pressure was there politically to increase the number of women in the 70s. And they introduced affirmative action, which is like quota, you know, requiring that the universities get some women into the faculties. So the first progress of getting more women into the professor position was based on this affirmative action. And what you also can see is that after the pressure came on that they hire more women, then from 1975 to 1995, 20 years, nothing happened afterward. The number of women stayed constant. And remember this, because I'll bring you then the example of ETH. And then there was a second push with affirmative action. And this one was actually triggered by these women who got together, these 22 women, actually 16 out of 17 tenured women professors got together because they felt like that they did not get equal opportunities and equal chance, equal resources, equal access to privileges as their male colleagues, and started to collect data. So this then ultimately resulted in this MIT report. But before they contacted also the leadership. I'll talk about this in a little bit. And they ultimately listened to these women. They didn't push them away. And then helped to collect more data, which then was published in the 1999 MIT report. In this report, it was written that one woman said the feeling of an injustice, the anger that accumulates from this recognition, and the strong desire for change for themselves and future generation was a motivation for these women to ultimately get engaged and get going. Something very important and amazing at that time happened for these women at MIT because they approached the leadership, and that was the Dean, Bergeron, and the President West, two men in leadership position at MIT who were actually listening to these women and ultimately agreed that they collect more data. And then the President West on the MIT report in the first page wrote, first, I have always believed that contemporary gender discrimination within university is part reality and part perception. True, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of this balance. Second, I like most of my male colleagues believe that we are highly supportive of our junior women faculty members. This is also true. They generally are content and well supported in many, though not all dimensions. However, I sat bolt upright in my chair when a senior woman who has felt unfairly treated for some time said, I also felt very positive when I was young. So that was something that the MIT report clearly showed. As women moved up and became even more successful, I mean, many of these MIT women were really extraordinarily successful, they felt more and more discriminated as they moved up in their position. I mean, one significant problem for us women is, this is, for example, written in the book Lean In, and there is a lot of pro and cons, you know, what is written in the Lean In book, so I recommend the other two books first to read. But just in that regard, everybody agrees there is a stereotypical bias. When a woman excels at her job, both male and female coworkers will remark that she may be accomplishing a lot, but she's not well liked by her peers. Both women and men. Women have the same stereotypical bias as the men because all the leaders we're seeing are male. She's probably also too aggressive, not a team player, a bit political, and can't be trusted or difficult. A hostile working culture with this stereotypical bias can result in character assassination, Rufmord in German, because it's very easy to spread rumors and isolating targets about these women, okay? Because there's such a minority. Many people don't even speak to those strong women for whatever the reason. And there is also a blog written by a colleague of mine, Liar, Liar, Campus on Fire, how to cope with dishonest colleagues. I mean, one recommendation, if you hear something about a successful senior woman, don't repeat the story, even so you think it's believable. You know, go and ask the woman, is this true? You might actually hear a different story. These women are very often assumed to be guilty until proven innocent, and very easily isolated. And that can increase the risk for both upward and downward bullying. We basically saw how very successful women in the German-speaking university started to become demoted, fired. These are three early examples: Professor Heike Egner in Austria, Professor Tanja Siegner, who was a director of the Max Planck Institute, and Professor Marcella Carollo, who was a physics professor in my department, my only other colleague when that happened. And basically, when you look at these stories, they're very similar. They were all accused of bad leadership with anonymous accusations. And very often they used actually the complaints of junior women to ultimately take these women out. That's a warning about the bias of what women have against senior women. You know, we senior women, we grew up in a man's world. If we behave like a man, that's not okay. We can't push hard for performance. The women will not accept it because they assume, hey, I want to have more empathy. They accept, you know. Actually, a good colleague of mine at one point in a blog said, hey, I'm your professor and not your mother, right? You know, at the end, we want to get performance. And they accept certain behavior from a male professor, but not from a woman professor. And these complaining women were instrumentalized by my male colleagues to get rid of the senior woman they never liked. So that didn't help the younger women, because if the senior women are treated like this is your future. So think about it. Of course, we can prepare. I mean, we're going now around and tell all senior women, be careful how you interact with your students, you know, be clear, you know, make it a topic about the bias, start discussing it, that actually women have also a bias against senior women, that we are not doing this to harass women when we ask for performance. And this was then also becoming a topic in this manager magazine that was published 2020. One of the German manager and politicians, he said, this is a career risk, especially for women. Think about it. You know, I've never seen in my whole career at the university a definition of a good manager. And then suddenly, you know, these women were taken down because of so-called bad management. I've seen a lot of management in my male collegial environment. Let me tell you, it's nothing what happened with what these women did in comparison to what my male colleagues get away with it. So these were just the first three that I became aware of. And then, you know, this was so good of getting rid of the competition of the senior women who didn't play the same games as the guys who were used to it. And so more women were at risk. And so we then started an open letter because we were actually organized at ETH because we already had the Women Professor Forum. And we started an open letter signed by 145 women scientists expressing their concerns as they wanted to demote and fire another Max Planck director. And we organized that from our Women Professor Forum. Basically, my colleague, Janet Herring, who was then the president of the Women Professor Forum, and we mobilized everybody that we knew. And in this open letter, we wrote, we are writing to express our concern at the highly publicized dismissals, demotion, and conflicts involving female directors at the Max Planck Institute. Similar reports have also publicized cases involving women in top academic position at the University of Copenhagen, ETH Zurich, and the University of London, indicating that these issues involving senior women extends well beyond the Max Planck Institute. And in reality, a failure of a highly successful individual who has attained a high rank is in a very real sense an institutional failure. In many of these cases, they were grievance processes didn't even work. Things were hopelessly escalating in all ways, power games, and so on. So it was definitely an institutional failure. So this is just to show you again that after the initial progress at MIT to get the number up here, for 20 years leaving the system going in the hope we're bringing some women in and things will get better, nothing happened anymore. We did not get more women in. That basically means we need additional measures, and a good number that people kind of say we need at least 30% so that the minority people, I mean the women, can start influencing the culture, the work culture, so that it works also for them. Because at this point, the work culture, the organization, the governance has been done by men and it works for men. But that doesn't mean that's the best way to do it. So we need additional measures to get it up to about 30%. The current culture works for the majority, and the culture has no interest to change because it works perfectly for the majority. In the physics department, after they hired the first women, basically 2 women direct hire in 93, and then an additional dual career hire, Marcella Carollo, later on, because they wanted a man, so they had to hire the woman, and so you can see how welcome she was. Not really. Besides that, for 22 years, every single professor selection committee resulted in selecting a man. 24-0. During the same time, the number of students have been growing to 20%, and not even 10% in these 22 years made it, right? Only because of the crisis that we had in the physics department, firing a tenured professor position, Carollo, and then they were stuck with me complaining, hey, this is a discrimination case. They basically figured they better get some more women in. And within 2 years, with a direct hire looking for excellent women, they hired 5 tenure-track female assistant professor with saying, we're just looking for excellent any field because the constellation was that many of us are now slowly but surely retiring within the next 5 years. And then we're just looking for excellent women, any kind of field, and then we see later on how we hire more of the professors. And then, surprise, actually, my colleagues said, wow, they were surprised how excellent the women were. But for 22 years, in comparison to a man, they never saw the excellence of a woman. And of course, when you do something like this, there is the stigma. Token woman, perception of reverse discrimination, right? This was an all-woman search. And that requires that we actually start dealing with it, because we should not tell all these women as they are moving along, oh, you were hired because you were a woman. I was hired because I was a woman, because that was 93. That was after the woman demonstration, and there was political pressure to basically hire me. But, you know, I tenured Tom of the class, you know, all the qualification was there, but still people said I was hired because I was a woman. So, you know, this kind of stuff has to stop. I keep telling to every single male, stop saying that. Look at the facts. Look at the grades. Look at the qualification before you say something like this. You know, a typical situation is really this cartoon, how women experience it, who are hired under this token hire. At the beginning, you have this honeymoon. This is done with basically a woman of color, but you know, it's a minority. A woman of color is a double minority, which is even worse. But let me just go with this one, woman of color. White leadership is the majority. Token hire, at the beginning you have the honeymoon. The woman of color feels welcome, needed, and happy. And then the reality kicks in. There is repetitive injury, microaggression, you know, comments like, oh, you're hired just because you're a woman. This is microaggression. This hurts the feelings of the other person and is diminishing her self-confidence. It's not okay to say that. This is sexual harassment, actually gender harassment also referred to. It's not okay. But this, you know, they're exposed to that. And so the women of color points out issues within the organization. She tries to work within the organization structure and policies. She pushes for accountability so that people who say that are being pulled aside and said, this is not okay. And if you continue to do this, then we're not going to have you here anymore. Okay? Then there is a denial of racism. The organization denies, ignores, and blames. The responsibility of facing the problem is placed on the woman of color. People of color are getting pitted against one another. This is basically divide and conquer. So find one woman who feels happy to justify why this is all your fault, why you're not feeling happy. Classic example, you know, well known, victimize the victims. And then ultimately, retaliation. The organization decides that the woman of color is the problem and targets her. The organization labels the conflict as a communication issue or claims that she is not qualified or not good fit. And ultimately, the woman leaves or gets fired or whatever. That's the normal process. So I'm trying to motivate a lot of women to go into science and technology because it's really a really good thing. I mean, I have no regrets that I go into it. But I now, as I'm more senior, I want to make sure this is not happening to the women that I try to motivate, because this is not right. We cannot lose all of these women again. As I was processing in my career, and my kids were growing up, I basically stepped up into a leadership. I became a director. It was a co-leading house with a male colleague at the University of Bern. And we're leading the NZCR MAST from 2010 to 2022. And as I said, the National Science Foundation asked the leadership of the NZCR to do something for the advancement of women. So because of the MIT report experience, I then got the Women Professor Forum. I got us women organized. You have to understand that we grew up in a men's world, and we knew we never, ever, ever do any women issue topic, because otherwise we get killed in our careers. So we had to really convince our senior women that we are now getting networked and that this will not be negative for their careers if we stick together. So it took actually a while to convince the women, but we did an extra effort so that we had all the leading women actually part of it. This is a picture of the first assembly. I could gain Janet Herring as the vice president, who was the director of EAWAG and very independent in that regard from ETH. And we first built up a network to build a culture. We did scientific lunches, informal mentoring, access to information. And actually any leadership who values the minorities and so on, they should support things like this. Even give them access to leaderships with question, discussion, and so on. But the amazing supportive MIT leadership was not there at ETH. People were actually a little bit worried. They were asking suddenly, what are you guys talking about? You know, they were actually worried that we got networked. Ultimately, through our efforts, we never felt like, you know, all our proposals were for better governance, because we started working on this governance issue, accountability, transparency, access to information flow, decision making, and so on, because all of the thing was done by informal power groups, and decisions were already done ahead of time, and so on. We finally, one woman had this idea, this was a really great idea, is to just do a questionnaire and then publish it. So you can also read it. What we all agreed on, over 90% of all faculty, women faculty at ETH and EPFL, said that an inclusive work culture set by the leadership plays an important role in the success of WIN. We, in terms of the leadership, when we set up the Women Professor Forum, we wanted that not one woman dominates this organization. So we limited from the start in our network that we can only be there for 4 years, and then we give it to a next woman, that we have a broad basis of women that actually support our network. So Janet Herring took over 2016. And then basically in 2021, we could not motivate another senior woman to step up to become the next president, because it was a harakiri job. If anything, people said, oh, we like the Women Professor Forum, but not leadership like you. That's what they said to me. Then afterwards, they said the same thing to Janet, because we wanted change. And as long as we wanted change, they didn't like the leadership. And then on top of it, we had this crisis that ETH fired the first professor ever, 2019, who was actually a co-founder, also helping us building up the Women Professor Forum. And we have been trying to get a fair, unbiased due process since 2017. She was fired based on anonymous accusation, which stayed anonymous to the end. Goes against principles. So that, of course, shook up ETH pretty badly. It's a big failure of governance. And she ultimately went to court, the Swiss Federal Administrative Court, and the court ruled that the dismissal was disproportionate and unjustified. However, she could not prove that this was gender discrimination. And that's a real problem here in Switzerland. Because how do you prove gender discrimination on a single case? At this MIT report, what you can also read in this report is, with only a few isolated women, patterns of discriminations are hard to recognize. So it's written, often it is difficult to establish discrimination as a factor, because any one case, no matter how disturbing or aberrant, can usually be ascribed to its special circumstances. After all, she wasn't so nice, right? Thus, we need to develop safeguards to prevent and promptly correct the experiences that together constitute gender discrimination. Identifying bias requires a systematic evaluation of multiple cases, but unfortunately, the privacy rules that we are using here in Switzerland actually shield the organization and actually protect the organization because they don't need to provide the information of comparable cases, how they handled it in a similar conflict situation. And this is really a serious problem in the law. This is the Economist evaluation of the glass ceiling index published 2024. The Economist makes this annual measure of the role and influence of women in the workplace. You see here, these are 29 countries since 2016 to 2023. The good news is Switzerland is better than Japan, Turkey, and South Korea. The bad news is we are worse than everybody else. And we have been constant with no progress whatsoever in all these years. I mean, even Japan is now slowly, because, you know, they refused having kids. So they're slowly making progress. You know, pretty soon, if we're not moving something in Switzerland, even Japan will surpass us in this evaluation. So, you know, why do we have this? Why do we not make any progress? The MIT report says patterns of discrimination are hard to recognize on a single case. Now, we only got the Swiss Gender Equality Act in 1995. So this is actually that legally we have equal rights. So since 1995, we have equal rights. Before, I needed to ask my husband if I'm allowed to work. So we don't have to do that anymore. But we need better legal protection because it took a long time to get this 1995. And there is some compromises in there. It's very hard with this equal right law that we have for women to actually get right under a legal battle. A good example is Nathalie Urwiller at the University of Bern. She is one of the few cases who was able to prove that she was discriminated. And the first judgment was 2017. But then the university basically appeals every single legal judgment going to the next level, where every time it was said by our courts that this is discrimination, what happened to her, they then went on to the next level. And the university leadership did that all with tax money. They are paid. They're using all these appeals paid by tax money, whereas the victim has to pay the legal fees privately. This cost you, you know, over 500,000. This is not cheap. A lawyer costs 250 an hour. You just explain, ding, 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 ding. You know, and this, I mean, she was dismissed, which was considered discrimination in 2014. The process is still ongoing. How on earth is this? Why are we not on the street for this case alone? How is it possible that we use our tax money to go and appeal our courts, which actually said it was discrimination, whereas the victim has to pay privately over and over again? I mean, isn't that insane? No. It just happens. Next case, Marcella Carollo. She went all the way to the administrative court, which is very friendly to our organizations, and if possible, protects them, even if bad leadership is taking place. The judgment was, it was not justified to fire her, but you have to prove that it is discrimination, otherwise you're not employed anymore. So the Swiss law, equal right. Even so, the judgment is, it was unfair to fire her, she stays fired. You have to prove that it's discrimination. But on a single case, you cannot prove it. And actually, it's a judgment of 100 pages. You can read it. On page 84, the court actually acknowledges difficulties of getting access to details of comparative cases because she knew cases. I mean, I knew a very similar case very closely too, handled totally differently, very well connected male individual with the leadership, could do anything. Nothing happened to this guy, got promoted. However, according to our law, there is no entitlement to information or access to files on potential comparative cases justified by personal rights of individuals involved. Yeah, I'm sorry, I mean, we all can share information and still protect the individual's rights, but that they don't need to show anything is a little bit an easy thing. So what we need to do now is we need to reduce the excessive standards of data privacy of institutions that use it. And many of us see definitely a clear pattern of discrimination. And we need better legal protection against gender harassment. At least we could start doing this in Switzerland with publicly funded organizations, because this is paid by tax money. I'm sorry to say that they don't need to show how they do similar judgments is, in my opinion, unacceptable, but this is currently the law. And then on top of it, you know, Switzerland is always here. We are hosting in Geneva the human rights things, but we have no whistleblower protection. So if you step up as a woman or even a man witnessing something, you might become a target too. There's no whistleblower protection in Switzerland. Isn't that really a sad story for Switzerland, guys? I would say this is pretty sad. So we should actually have some whistleblower protection, because at the end, we want to make sure that we defend the equal right. And we're not doing this. The other thing is the governments. In a lot of the universities, they are organized by the leadership and the department. And departments have a lot of autonomy in the leadership or the institute. And we need to separate the scientific autonomy from the management autonomy. What do I mean with this? One of the root causes, looking back now to my 30 plus years, is that we mix this up. Because accountability and transparency is a basic requirement that needs to be enforced. This is not up to the department. So for example, in my physics department, 2014, the department voted away the transparency, how much money every professor gets from the budget that the department receives. The majority of the professors voted to reduce transparency. I was one of the few who said no, because for me, when you cut down transparency, this is just the beginning of the trouble of an organization. And you know, that was 2014, and 2019, we had a woman fired, right? So there. And you know, a lot of highly ranked science organizations like the Max Planck Institute and ETH are too often considered untouchable. They argue their scientific excellence would be damaged if autonomy is not preserved, because if administrators are coming in, oh my gosh, taking, you know, destroying science. But this is used to maintain status quo for well-established informal power groups. The strong autonomy of department drives many issues and hinders progress, because in the current academic working culture, it's a lot of informal power groups that are running the show. These insider groups are used to their privileges and are not ready to share them with an unbiased, fair, and transparent procedure and accountability for leadership position, because it's easier if you can just decide what you want to do, and then, you know, we don't have to justify it. A step in the right direction in Switzerland was that in March 2023, the academic leadership announced the first Sexual Harassment Awareness Day in Switzerland, you know, with everybody saying, oh, we're having a day and we are not supporting sexual harassment. Yeah, and created a lot of nice glossy text in all the web pages of the university. But do we really see action? Not really, in my opinion. MIT acknowledged that they have discriminations 20 years ago. And MIT is still #1 in most university ranking. It didn't, and they did actually do something, really change something. So I think we need to have an action plan. We need measurable results, and we need a sign up and empower a consortium of stakeholders, people affected, the critical voices, the experts in administration, and empower them to make actual change and not just recommendations. And I really think that a better governance is better for us all, because we're just wasting a lot of time, including our male colleagues, because we have a hard time to even find a person to become department head. And when they become department head, very often they say never again, because, you know, if you have one problem can take 99% of your time. And the professors are not trained for it, they are not motivated by it, and the tendency is that they just simply ignore it, and that doesn't make the problems go away normally, okay? And that's where we are standing right now. And professors are very scared of management, but actually we're not trained to manage a diverse environment at this point, I would say. And we need help, and we cannot do it anymore alone, because otherwise we end up with the mess that we actually have. So with this, I would like to conclude. I mean, what I also like to see, you know, we're at ETH, we don't have colleagues in law, in history, and so on. We see now in Switzerland more and more women getting organized and stepping up and complaining. And many of us get pushed back, you know, because anybody who complains is a troublemaker, including me, actually, by the way. What we are needing now is that somebody comes and also looks at all these cases. They are very well documented. You know, right now, ETH tries with everything to not have an independent, truly independent group to look at what they've done. We still have women who are being academically mobbed and hanging in there. And we need to stop this. This is not okay for our current academic leadership to do this and get away with it. We don't accept this anymore. And we're not becoming quiet. So there are actually excellent programs done in the UK, which is the so-called the Juno project, specially developed for physics departments, which are very hard to change. And they made actually some really good success. They got all the professors engaged in changing the governance and the culture so that this works for a larger, diverse group of people. And, you know, this did not happen by its own. They were very clear. If you don't do this, you don't get any funding. And that's how it changed. Doesn't happen on its own. With this, I would like to conclude. We don't have legal people, history people, but you at the university, you have those. We would like to encourage these faculties to get in touch with us. We have lots of things. We can get the students involved in looking at these cases and document this, because you should really come and look what is actually happening. We're actually right now fighting in the trenches. I mean, we get beaten up all the time. But, you know, we're not giving up, and you need to see what is actually happening. And if a broader group of people starts understanding what is going on right now, actually we can make a change. And so please feel free to contact us, and we can provide you with information. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. I appreciate that you talk a lot about the institutional and the legal aspects of the topic. I was wondering, I mean, I guess one very big aspect is also the more individual way how, like, unconscious bias and these topics that are less on the institutional but more on the individual level. Do you believe that there is a positive change? Because you talked a lot about things not changing at all or stagnating. I was wondering whether you, in your opinion, there is a kind of a generational topic to this more individual perspective?
I mean, I actually think, you know, there is some change, but when it really comes down to in the competition for really important positions, I see actually nearly negative progress. You know, when I came into the physics department, I was simply ignored. But I knew exactly what I wanted, and I didn't at the beginning realize how isolated I was at the beginning until I got pregnant, and then all hell broke loose. But I was ignored. Now the women are coming in, and we have all these frustrated male guys who basically are convinced that there is reverse discrimination. I actually think it becomes to a certain extent more hostile, you know, and so one side it gets better, other side it becomes actually kind of nasty. I actually even know of women who don't even celebrate their awards anymore because they feel like, oh my God, somebody's going to tell me I got it because I'm a woman. And after a while, they even believe that they got the prize because they're a woman. They can't even celebrate. But if you get a prize, you would not even think twice not to feel clear that you got it because you deserve it, right? I mean, that's sick. No, we also need to learn to celebrate. So if a woman achieves something, I mean, a healthy department can celebrate their colleagues' success. You know, when I go to conferences and there is a prestigious award and I see how at the University of Santa Barbara, they invite all their colleagues and friends for an apéro at an important conference to celebrate their colleague winning an award. Now, that never happened to me at all, right? We're not celebrating. And I think celebration is part of a good culture for everybody. We should celebrate.
Other questions from the audience?
And by the way, you can do a test online at Harvard because Harvard had equal problem, you know, that they always hire the white male. There is a test if you are biased. I flunked the test. So most of us will flunk the test. And the only way about the bias is that you actively start. You know, you have to nearly stop before you react. You have to train not to react without the brain having time to actually get the rational going. And that needs training and that needs education. And if we're not getting that under control, you just go and, you know, get your anger or whatever feeling you have out, and it causes damage.
Thanks. Just to follow up on this, is there actually some program going on where like people can train that? Being rational in becoming, yeah.
No, I mean, that's a good question. And I wish, you know, I watched my two boys going through ETH. They just finished their master's degree. They had never, ever a training. I mean, of course, they grew up with me, with us as parents, so they got a little bit more training in that regard. But no, I mean, that was also one of the requests we had as the Women Professor Forum, that we have mandatory training for everybody on this one. And you need to have safe space with each group, because I think you should express your anger and let's deal with it. Because if we are not dealing with your feelings, you cannot fight these feelings, because there's a lot of data that actually shows that, that the feeling of reverse discrimination is not good, and how you can actually also help, you know, as a bystander to fight this kind of discrimination steps, right? Some of you might even have daughters, you know, these are normally the, you know, very smart and good-looking daughters who go into academia, and these guys normally become really good colleagues for us, helping us because they see their daughter going through the same thing, right? So I actually think there should be mandatory for every single student entering the university in the first year. And what is okay, what is not okay, what the obligations are. There's a lot of young women telling me, you know, there's all these stupid comments all the time. How should I react? You know, to be honest, you know, I give them normal survival mode of operation help. And we have hired a lot of coaches at ETH. They don't coach the guys to behave. No, they coach the women to survive in this environment, right? So this is the wrong approach, right? That's not how we should do it, right?